This morning's story is something a little different. It is a story poem, and it is by Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo was born in Oklahoma to Cherokee and Muscovy parents, and she became involved in the American Indian protest movement in the 60s and 70s. She became an activist poet through that work and is prolific and became a poet laureate of the United States. And this is her poem story, Rabbit is Up to Tricks. In a world long before this one, there was enough for everyone, until someone got out of line. We heard it was Rabbit, fooling around with clay and the wind. Everybody was tired of Rabbit's tricks, and no one would play with him. He was lonely in this world. So Rabbit thought to make a person. And when he blew into the mouth of that figure to see what would happen, the clay man he made stood up. So Rabbit showed the clay man how to steal a chicken. The clay man obeyed. Then Rabbit showed the clay man how to steal some corn, and the clay man obeyed. Then Rabbit showed him how to steal someone else's wife, and the clay man obeyed. Rabbit felt important and powerful. The clay man felt important and powerful. But once that clay man started, he could not stop. Once he took that chicken, he wanted all the chickens. And once he took that corn, he wanted all the corn. And once he took that wife, he wanted all the wives. He was insatiable. Then he got a taste of gold, and he wanted all the gold. And then it was land and everything else he saw. His wanting only made him want more. Soon it was countries, and then it was trade. The wanting infected the earth. We lost track of the purpose and reason for life. We began to forget our songs. We forgot our stories. We could no longer see or hear our ancestors, or talk with each other across the kitchen table. Forests were being mowed down all over the world, and Rabbit had no place to play. Rabbit's trick had backfired. Rabbit tried to call the clay man back. But when the clay man wouldn't listen, Rabbit realized he'd made a clay man with no ears, and Rabbit didn't know how to talk to him.
November is Native American Heritage Month, and just coincidentally, a week from Thursday, the Thanksgiving holiday will be celebrated. In many public schools, there is a pageant. Children dress up as 17th century English freeholders, and other children dress up as American Indians, and they're supposed to get along. At least that's how the teacher imagines American Indians would act, how they would dress. Decorations are around the room of the school. For over a century, 150 years, I figured now, 150 years, the story of the Indians who came to dinner and made peace is told as the founding story of our nation. On the other hand, for 50 years, American Indians from all over New England and New York and New Jersey, descendants of the original peoples of the Western Hemisphere, gather in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the home of the so-called First Thanksgiving, and protest the false story told there. Thousands demonstrate every year to remind us that the Puritans and the adventurers who exited the Mayflower were not simply innocent settlers coming to set up a camp in the wilderness, They were employees mostly, or freeholders in a company called the Plymouth Plantation, which was exchanged on the London Stock Exchange. Because, first of all, but they weren't innocent settlers setting up a camp in the wilderness, because Massachusetts wasn't a wilderness. It was lots and lots of villages, 20 villages within walking distance of Plymouth, if you can walk to Buzzards Bay. They cultivated crops, nurtured children, and lived their lives on this land. There was no wilderness. 1,000 years of agriculture. Yet the wilderness story is told over and over again. In fact, there's a journey into the wilderness is a theme for American historians to write about. And the concept of a wilderness to be explored and cultivated is a way of erasing the people who lived on this land in settled communities, had culture, developed agriculture, etc. So when the religious group called the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1620, they landed on what we now call Cape Cod and the South Shore locations. That there were, as I said, 20 villages close by. Those villages joined in a coalition, or what we would call an association, and that association goes by the name of Wampanoag, which means people who greet the dawn. The natives had lived here for over 1,000 years. They lived in round roofed houses. They were made of piles of poles and covered with sheets of birch bark and sealed tight with clay and cement. We now call those houses wigwams, and they weren't tents. They were nothing like the teepee structure that we see on the Western Plains, because they were permanent settlements, 7 or 8 years before they would build a new house. In the spring, they would fish in the rivers for salmon and herring. In the summer and autumn, they lived and dived. They dived for lobster and shellfish and speared bluefish on the coast. When I was 14, I actually dived for lobster off Nantasket. From December to April, they lived on food that they stored from the earlier months: maize, beans, squash, and lots of jams of berries. Thus, the indigenous political economy was not all that different from the agriculture of Europe, Africa, or Asia at the time. Each village had their own leaders called the village council, or English translation, and political power flowed upward from the adult women and men of the village. Very empowered for women, considering if you compare it to Europe at the time. They chose their moderators, or which they called sachem. The sachem's main skill was to settle disputes and organize the council conversation. The council of villages, usually about 20 villages, would come together in council, made decisions together through this and sometimes, basically, you talk about a council, but I think it's important to point out that it resembled, for the Wampanoag, it resembled what we call a clam bake, because it was several days camping and mostly eating seafood. So they conveniently organized their councils near a beach in the summer. Both women and men enforced the laws of the village. There was no police. This is also true of rural parts of Europe. So basically, the community itself kept the law, made sure that there was no felonies, I guess you could call them. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, were a people accustomed to living in a hierarchical, feudal social order, a class-based patriarchy. They brought that social order with them. Property owners of the Plymouth plantations brought servants and mercenary soldiers in tow. The manifest of passengers or people, human beings that got off the Mayflower, shows that only 1/3 of them could vote. The rest were servants, hirelings. Miles Standish, everyone knows this about Miles Standish. Miles Standish was a professional soldier. He was the leader of the militia, or the armed group of professional soldiers, and he was experiencing wars against Catholics in Europe and Ireland. He was a soldier, and that's why he was brought to Plymouth. He also brought in a way of looking at the world based on domination and conquest. God, in their view, had given men dominion over their families. Women were subject to the head of the household, her husband, her father, her master, depending on the relationship, always subordinate. God was seen as a very powerful king whose power was unlimited, and even by the processes of the cosmos. God was power incarnate. God was good only as far as his orders, his will was obeyed. God was mean if his orders were not obeyed. God's love was experienced as forgiving sinful children who begged for forgiveness and administered on the basis of merit. Now, these people from England, these invaders from England, knew, they were convinced as a matter of religion that humankind had dominion over the land and the creatures of the land. And thus, the earth was occupied and evolved, and animals were regarded as property to be used. Now, that all may seem familiar. If you think about it, there are lots of religious communities in the United States that teach that right now. Basically, patriarchy, domination, a feeling that nature is something that belongs to us. The kind of religion exists, still has followers, still impacts the ethical and moral world of our body politic. But the original people of this land had a different worldview. For the indigenous people, the cosmos was creative and sustaining. The earth and sky were sacred. They did not depend on the sacred texts of ancient revelations. The earth did not belong to them. They belonged to the earth. The Bible Commonwealths, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, all had a common policy relative to the indigenous people. They had that policy before they ever met an indigenous person. When they were in England, they viewed themselves as chosen people, and their role was acting out the chosen people narrative in Exodus and the book of Joshua. They were called to build a city on a hill that would be a model for the world on how to conduct themselves. They were a holy people, and they were to fight holy wars. If you read the book of Joshua, you see that was conquer these people, conquer that people. The book of Joshua in the Hebrew scriptures. So there's a holy people mythology. And they viewed the indigenous people of New England as Canaanites. They actually wrote that word, Canaanites. The Jews had conquered the Canaanites. They would conquer the Canaanites of New England. They, the Puritans, were here to conquer those who were native to this place. That was their view. The indigenous people were to be enslaved, subjected to Christian rule, or if they proved incorrigible, they were to be eliminated. This was written down in 1629 by the Massachusetts Bay Company. It was not different from William Bradford. William Bradford was the governor of Plymouth Colony. He rejoices in his diary that God had swept the land of savages by sending diseases among them. Praise God, he has given them diseases and they're dead. Now, the indigenous people who met the Pilgrims were hospitable people relative to these Puritans, but they were very wary of the Pilgrims, very wary of the settlement in Plymouth, and for good reason. When the Pilgrims landed, they did not bring in enough to tide them over, and they basically survived by raiding the stored grains and other foods of the indigenous peoples on Cape Cod and the place they call Plymouth. Mercenary soldiers and armed pilgrims made the encampment at Plymouth a fortress, and there's a limit to raiding other people's storehouses. They wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for a man who came along and introduced himself to them. So I'm going to talk about Tisquantum. 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 The English called him Squanto. A lot of names that we have from the Algonquin peoples are been shortened for English pronunciation. So the English called him Tisquantum. He was originally from the village of Petaca, which he spoke good English, probably better English than some politicians today. Patuxet was on the exact site where the Pilgrims built Plymouth, exact place. And it was on the Patuxet grain stores that kept the Pilgrims from starving. So who was Tisquantum? 1605, that's 15 years before the Pilgrims came. Tisquantum had been captured as a slave by an English raider, kidnapped by an English marauder who was called John Weymouth. John Weymouth. I don't know, his name strikes a bell. Weymouth made his fortune by raiding along the coast of New England, and apparently he and other raiders and merchants left diseases among the people along this coast. So as hundreds of indigenous people were raided, captured, brought into slavery, and in the contact with these slave owners, diseases were introduced that were not, there was no immunity built up in indigenous community. So Weymouth had made his fortune raiding, and he exhibited Tisquantum as a savage from the New World in carnivals and other events in England. So here is this young man, 15 years old, being looked at, and it says, savage from the New England. During his captivity, he learned to speak English. And he was sold from the carnival people, sold him as a slave to the Spanish, and he ended up in the Caribbean for several years. He chose the name Tisquantum, which translates the wrath of God. You can see this young man who had gone through slavery, been mocked at a carnival, just saying, the wrath of God. And he was able to use his English language skills to get passage back to England, where he found Weymouth, who sent Tisquantum back to his homeland in the company of another kidnapped Indian named Somerset. And Tisquantum arrived in the spring of 1620, some 7 months before the Mayflower arrived. And they found the village deserted, the village of Patuxet. That's where Tisquantum had grown up. Skeletons everywhere. Everyone in the village had died at the hands of English slavers and the diseases that they had brought. They stayed inside another village near Buzzards Bay for the next year. When the Mayflower arrived, Tisquantum and Somerset were informed that the English had come, and because they knew English, they were asked to watch the Pilgrims for weeks. They counseled with Massasoit, who was the sachem, who was the convener of the villages on Cape Cod and Plymouth County and Bristol County, that southeastern part of the... He consulted with Massasoit, and Massasoit watched them carefully. What the heck is going on? They were concluding that the Pilgrims were not slavers. They were not here to capture slaves. And they seemed to be setting up structures that meant they intended to stay. But what was really mystifying to the Wampanoag was, unlike any Englishman, any European they had seen on this coast before, they brought women and children. Women and children. Oh, somebody coming to steal adolescents for slavery or to trade furs or whatever, it's not going to bring women and children. They're building structures that looks like they're going to stay, and they brought women and children. It was a puzzle. It was decided to make contact. The Tisquantum and Somerset walked into the English village and said, "Welcome!" You could imagine that. It's two guys, it's spring, so they're not well dressed, saying, "Welcome," in English, to these people who think they were given the land as a holy gift. Now, the invaders were not in good condition. They were living in dirt-covered shelters. There was a shortage of food. Nearly half of them had died in the previous winter. The Pilgrims had brought wheat with them to plant. Wheat. Do you know of any wheat crops on Massachusetts coast? It wasn't going to work in 100 years. It hasn't worked in how many is it? Several hundred years now. And they were totally unprepared for living in the ecology. The Pilgrims were in a desperate situation, needed help. They were basically the Wampanoag, Massasoit, asked Tisquantum to stay with the Pilgrims for the next few months, and his mission is find out what the Pilgrims are doing. Right? That's what his job was. It wasn't some random Indian that walked into the camp and said, "I can help you out here." He was sent because he knew English to figure out what they were doing. I think the word is spy. Massasoit thought making friends with these intruders might provide a buffer, even an ally, against the slave raiders. And they might provide trade goods. So Tisquantum stayed in Plymouth to spy on the Pilgrims and try to forge an alliance and hopefully to make friends. As Tisquantum's request, the indigenous people brought the Pilgrims deer meat and beaver skins. This is all summer. They're basically, the Wampanoag are feeding Plymouth on the hope that these people with guns might be helpful someday if they make an alliance, and an alliance based on, we give you this, you support us in this. Makes sense, right? Makes sense if you trust English people. He taught them how to cultivate corn and new vegetables. They learned vegetables they never knew how to grow before, never seen. How to build warm Indian-style houses, wigwam. He pointed out poisonous plants and showed how plants could be used as medicine. He explained how to dig and cook clams, how to get sap from maple trees, use fish for fertilizer, dozen of other skills needed for survival in this new world. By the time fall arrived, things were going so much better for the Pilgrims. The corn they planted was going well. There was enough food to last for winter. They were living comfortably in their wigwams. They had managed to build one European-style building out of square logs, and that was their church. And they had better health. They weren't coming down with all kinds of diseases, and they knew how much more about surviving in this new land. The Pilgrims agreed to have a treaty with the natives, which was offered by the Wampanoag. So yes, there was a picnic, a feast to celebrate. But the natives were not guests at a Puritan Thanksgiving, because first of all, the word Thanksgiving was never used. The word Thanksgiving was only used by Puritans in that century to designate a victory over Indians or heretics like Anne Hutchinson. That's the only time Thanksgiving was used. And it involved fasting. Not feasting, fasting. So it wasn't called a Thanksgiving. It was called a dinner, a celebration. There was a large turnout of Wampanoag, of natives, 90. So the majority of people at this dinner, picnic, were actually not Pilgrims. There were maybe 40 Pilgrims. Tisquantum asked the Wampanoag to come because his mission is building an alliance. The Pilgrims were not prepared to feed a gathering of so large for 3 days. They weren't prepared. They sort of expected 10 friends to come, but 90. Massasoit comes, and within an hour of being in the camp, he dispatches people to run back to the village, go home, get more food. So almost all the food at this picnic are supplied by the Wampanoag. 5 deer, 12 wild turkeys, fish, beans, squash, corn soup, cornbread, berries, wild rice. Now, one of the things that was noted by the Puritans is that the Indian women sat together with the Indian men to eat. Doesn't shock you, does it? The Indian women sat together with the Indian men to eat, while the Pilgrim women stood quietly behind the table and waited for their men to finish eating and take the dishes away, and then the women ate. Peculiar, but that was their way. Massasoit gave Plymouth Plantation permission to clear the forest in the vicinity of Pawtucket, and they agreed to live in peace. Now, it would be wishful thinking to say this friendship lasted a long time. The written record left by the English indicates a disdain for the natives. They're writing about what these people that have sort of saved their lives are visiting them, and they write that they are heathens and savages, and that's how they define them. The Pilgrims told the indigenous people, they told them to their face that their religion was ungodly and a mark of damnation. How to win friends and influence people. Your religion is going to send you to hell, by the way. There were other clashes in culture. One of the things the indigenous people did that could be called aggressive, I don't know, but because they didn't see it as aggressive, is the children in Wampanoag communities didn't wear any clothing in the summer. It's warm, so they didn't wear clothing. So the Indian children would run through the woods naked. Well, they would run through the settlement at Plymouth naked too. Lots of diary entries indicate that the Pilgrims were very bothered by this naked children running through their village. So differences in beliefs, differences in cultural practices, actual violence. The men of Plymouth became concerned by the sinful example of the Indian women who only wore a loincloth during the whole summer. They feared that the wanton nudity would seduce their sons and provide a bad example for their daughters. So they were very desirous that the Indians be gone from this earth. So they first pushed the indigenous people away, then they wanted the natives gone, and more armed English Puritans arrived as the villages around Plymouth started to be populated, and the villages around Boston started to be populated. There had been 100 ships by the time 1635, 15 years, 100 ships, full of people. Even more mercenary soldiers. There were at least 300 mercenary soldiers under the Massachusetts colony and 100 mercenary soldiers under the Plymouth Plantation Colony by the 1630s. Wars are fought to push the natives off the lands. Natives are enslaved and sent to the Sugar Islands. Villages are burnt. The subsequent history of New England Indians is a long, long story. Suffice it to say, the descendants of the original people of New England still live here. The headquarters of the Massachusetts is less than 2 or 3 miles from here. They remember their culture, they remember the invasion, and they call Thanksgiving Day a day of mourning. Having a day of Thanksgiving is a good thing. A good thing. But the so-called Thanksgiving story, the whole Pilgrim myth, warrants demonstrations and protests, and for 50 plus years, there have been demonstrations and protests. So let us sing and dance. It says we are dancing. We are dancing Sarah's Circle, number 212. May we hear the melody of life, find ourselves singing harmony. May we be open to the dissonance in the song of all the earth people, the dissonance in that song of all the earth people, that we might be part of a common urging toward justice, peace, and love. May we feel in our bones the rhythms of life as children of this earth and find ourselves dancing, dancing, dancing. Go in peace, go in love.